Scientists tell us that all forms of life originated in the sea, and the oceans of the world are teeming with diverse creatures, both plant and animal alike. The ocean, in fact, has also been the center of important human culture, and its eternal cycle has inspired human life for countless millennia. Among the more significant cultures to arise from dependence on the ocean because of great Western demand for its product are those dedicated to the harvesting of the pearl oyster. Pearl cultures have sprung up in those areas of the world where the cultivation of this ocean gem is most common. Parts of the Persian Gulf, Japan, and the coast of Ceylon or Sri Lanka off the southern coast of India. Pearl culture has been a part of life in Sri Lanka for over 2,000 years, and that island has traded in this precious commodity for centuries. Fascination with the pearl has been with us ever since, as well as curiosity about the people who cultivate and harvest what is often called the perfect gem. Now, 19th century audiences in France were no less curious than anyone else, demanding as they were of the new and the exotic to entertain and delight them in their theaters. Works about such exotic cultures abound from this time period. But it was the young Georges Bizet who focused in on a libretto concerning the Hindu pearl culture of Ceylon. He created for his audience a glimpse into a rarefied world that they could only partially imagine. The opera, while not a complete success, was Bizet's first professional introduction to the lyric stage, and it is the subject of our program today. The opera, Bizet's Les Pêcheurs de Perles, the Pearl Fishers. I'm Nick Reveles, and this is OperaTalk. Bizet was born on October 25, 1838, to a musical family, and he showed unusually precocious talent for music at a very early age. He was a brilliant pianist and organist, and was accepted into the Paris Conservatoire at the age of 10. His earliest operatic works were in the comic vein, like Docteur Miracle, a one-act operetta. It was written for a competition established by the master of Second Empire comic opera style, Jacques Offenbach. The jury for the competition was a who's who of French lyrical theater: Daniel Aubert, Fromental Halévy, Eugène Scribe, and Charles Gounod. The work was successful enough to grant him entree into the world of Paris theater, and he spent much of his short life as a rehearsal pianist for opera houses throughout the city. Early in his career, Bizet threw himself into a number of projects, many of which were stillborn. He was recognized as a brilliant pianist by no less a personage than Franz Liszt, and he spent some time playing solo concerts and making appearances in the ubiquitous salons. But it was by employment as a rehearsal pianist that he came to know the great operatic literature. In 1861, he met Léon Carvalho, the director of the Théâtre Lyrique. Carvalho was impressed with the young man's wit and talent, and it was the director's habit at the Lyrique to offer the young, untested, but promising composers of the day commissions to write work for the theater. The work that he commissioned from Bizet was to be The Pearl Fishers, and it was this composer's operatic calling card. Now let me tell you a little bit about the opera theaters in Paris. The most venerable institution was, of course, the Paris Opéra, which in the 1850s and 60s was experiencing a period of decline, run more like a social club for the aristocratic classes. It was thought of as something of a dinosaur by younger progressive artists, writers, and composers. There was also the Opéra Comique, which produced lighter fare with spoken dialogue. And then there was the Théâtre Italien, which had been granted exclusive rights to the performance of Italian opera in 1801, and was the first site in France of the first Italian performances of the Mozart da Ponte operas, as well as many of the bel canto classics. But the Théâtre Lyrique, the most serious rival to the Opéra and the Comique during its 20 years of existence, was chartered to perform French and non-French works, and was the site of the first French performances of works by Beethoven, Weber, Mozart, Verdi, and Wagner. Carvalho, the director of the Lyrique, was a brilliant stage director who spent so lavishly on his productions that the company was often in danger of going under. But he was committed to producing works by new composers. Bizet was certainly ready for the challenge. His compatriot, the composer Camille Saint-Saëns, upset by their lack of success as young composers, once said to Bizet, "Since they don't want us in the theater, let's take refuge in the concert hall." Bizet replied, "Well, that's all right for you, but I'm not made for the symphony. I need the theater. Without it, I don't exist." Bizet's relationship with the older and wiser Gounod was a great stimulus to him in the writing of his early works for the stage. After announcing to the composer that he had received the commission from the Lyrique, Gounod wrote him a long letter urging him, first of all, to take his time with the work, to try to envision many of the numbers in his head before actually writing anything down, and to keep the tone light. This was very wise advice, especially the caution about working too quickly. But in fact, Bizet worked himself into a frenzy to finish the piece and almost exhausted himself in the process. Given the commission in April 1863, the work went into rehearsal in August, a scant 4 months later. Originally, the librettists had set the story in Mexico, but during composition it was transferred to Ceylon and given various Indian and Hindu references. The plot, essentially a love triangle set in an exotic locale, was basically taken from earlier successful works like Spontini's La Vestale and Bellini's Norma. Although Carvalho, the director, was much more encouraging and congenial to young composers than other directors of the time, he often made things difficult for his production teams by making last-minute changes. He always wanted to make his own mark on another creator's works. Shifting the period or background of an opera at will was something he loved to do, or changing a dancing role into a singing role in order to give it to his soprano wife. Because of his wild spending, however, the productions of the fall of 1863 were extremely important to the theater. He needed a success in this theater as it was in grave debt. In the repertoire of the Théâtre Lyrique for that season were Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro and a triple bill of minor French works lavishly produced. The Pearl Fishers was due to premiere on September 14th, but because the soprano was ill, it was postponed to the 20th. Even then, the soprano was still slightly indisposed and was not able to give the best performance of the temple priestess, Leila. But the reception of the opening night audience was enthusiastic, as Parisian audiences at this time were used to embracing operas that had a touch of the exotic. The composer appeared on stage with the singers at the end of the opera, and a contemporary described the moment. Bizet looked a little dazed. His head was lowered and revealed only a forest of thick, curly, fair hair above a round, still rather childish face. Enlivened, however, by the quick, bright eyes that took in the whole audience with a delighted but embarrassed look. All of the composers in attendance looked to Bizet as the young leader of a new school of French theatrical composition, remarkable considering that he was only 25 years old. The critics, however, weren't amused. In the journal Figaro, the critic said, "There were neither fishermen in the libretto nor pearls in the music." The opera received 18 performances. It was not played again until about a decade after Bizet's untimely death at the age of 36, and since then, even though it's been produced more in Europe than elsewhere, it's never really left the standard repertoire for very long. The Pearl Fishers, while not the financial success that Leon Carvalho had hoped for, was enough of an artistic triumph for him to immediately commission Bizet to write one more opera. But it was a later commission from the Opéra Comique that was to make his name in music history and successfully produce one of the most popular and enduring operas of all time, Carmen. Who knows what would have happened if the composer had not literally worked himself to death barely 3 months after its premiere in 1875. Before the ruins of a Hindu temple, Durga, the leader of a tribe of pearl fishers, is chosen by his people to be their king. Nadir, his former friend, enters, and left alone by the chorus, they reminisce about their early days together. In their duet, one of the finest ensembles for two men in the operatic repertoire, they remember the beautiful woman that they both spied in the temple of Kandy. In order to remain friends and avoid being rivals for her love, they renounced her and swore fidelity to each other. Layla, the woman in question, appears with the high priest of Brahma, Nurabad. She has been chosen a priestess of Brahma to pray on behalf of the fishermen for good weather. Durga doesn't recognize her, but Nadir does, and he sees the spark of recognition in her eyes as well. As she enters the temple to pray, and Durga and the people leave as well, Nadir is left alone. He confesses in an aria that he has followed her here and has dreamt of her often since his youth. Nadir falls asleep as Layla sings a hymn to Shiva. When he awakes, it becomes a song of love. In Act 2, Layla tells Nurabad that she once saved a stranger's life by hiding him from his enemies. In return, he gave her a necklace that she still wears. The high priest leaves and she sings of her love of Nadir, who arrives in secret and sings a love duet with her. After he sneaks away, a gunshot is heard. Nadir is captured by the tribe, and he and Layla are about to be put to death when Durga, the new king, arrives on the scene. He pardons them and whispers to them to leave quickly, but during the ensuing chaos, she is unveiled. Durga immediately recognizes her as the woman that he and Nadir had sworn off so many years before. Angrily, he condemns them both to death. Act 3 finds Durga alone, singing of his inner turmoil over the possible loss of his best friend, Nadir. Layla arrives to plead with him for Nadir's life, but when Durga realizes that she loves Nadir, his fury is doubled. He calls on the fisherman to escort her to her doom, and she offers her necklace to one of the young guards. Durga snatches it away in fury, but as the couple are about to be burnt on a funeral pyre at the feet of a statue of Brahma, Durga recognizes the necklace as the very one he gave to Layla so many years before. The people see that their village has suddenly been set afire, and they rush out to save it. Durga shows Layla the necklace, then embraces the couple, sending them on their way. As he prompts their escape, he sees Nurabad and the fishermen escaping the burning village in the distance. Selfless love and friendship have triumphed. Since we're exploring Bizet's The Pearl Fishers, I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to bring in a designer who's going to be working on an actual production of this opera. And I'm delighted to welcome to OperaTalk Zandra Rhodes. Zandra, welcome.
Lovely to be here.
Now, you're in the midst of designing a production of this opera, and I'd like to ask you basically, how did you start? What was it about the story elements or the music of Bizet that first inspired your designs, and where did you go from there?
Well, first of all, typical, I had never heard of it. So I had got the tape from Ian Campbell and played the music, which is divine and romantic music. And he also gave me a leeway and he said, now, I have to tell you that Bizet probably never even went to Sri Lanka, which is Ceylon.
I think that's probably a good guess, yeah.
But I loosely could connect it with India, and I was invited to India to judge Miss India. And so I said, well, in that case, I'm going to go down and we're going to go to Sri Lanka. So I went to Sri Lanka and looked at all different things in it, and these wonderful caves that were medieval caves with wonderful naked ladies hanging from the ceiling, and then started to think that it would have a slightly exotic Indian feel. But on the other hand, the whole opera never refers to a single pearl. So I decided that I'd do a proscenium arch where the arches are covered and made of pearls. So it's going to be completely covered in pearls. And then just made to look very exotic and oriental.
Now, how about the color schemes? I mean, are the colors inspired by the colors that you saw in Sri Lanka?
Well, they are, although I didn't see pink and turquoise palm trees. So I felt that it should look very patterny, very exotic, and just then highlight these singers who will be just singing these beautiful duets. And as it's a French opera of that period, there'll also be wonderful dancing. So I've got some sort of semi-naked dancing girls coming along, and then we're doing the whole crowd scene in like turquoise saris and blues and creams like sand and the ocean. So it's going to be very exotic.
What about the textures of the materials that you use? Are you suggesting certain textures again to connect with the story or with what you experienced in Sri Lanka? Do they use lots of silks, for instance? Or?
Well, they have silks and cottons, so we've got lovely silks and Madras cottons, because Madras is only a little way away. And then they're going to be covered in hand-painted Zandra Rhodes details with seashells and pearls and things like that. So I think it's going to be rather wonderful.
Oh, I think it looks great. I'm about the main characters. Layla is a high priestess, so how do you designate her as opposed to the other?
She comes in veiled, and she's probably going to be in wonderful scarlet colours. We're still debating that. The priests are going to be in glowing, almost Buddhist yellows. And then, as I said, the crowd are going to be in blues and sands. So, and then probably the heroes will be in a colour that's in the middle, sort of emeralds and browns, so that they look rich and they stand out in front.
And Nurabad, the high priest, have you thought about?
He's
what
again,
direction?
I think he's going to be golden brown and sort of metallic-y.
Now, I've noticed that almost all of the show is hanging. It'll be coming from the fly space. Why is that?
I've been taking lots of advice, and I've been working with wonderful Andrew Sinclair. So luckily he's working with the Royal Opera in London. So we go backwards and forwards, and he said he wanted it with the things flying in.
He's the stage director.
Yes, he's
going
to.
So your work with him now
is
to work very closely to...
Yes, and then I work closely with John Paul Peters to go over, John David Peters, to work on the how it will actually work and where we have to cover up the lights and all those sort of things, which I didn't know about before.
It's interesting, I suppose, coming from the fashion world, and this is your second or third opera?
Second
Second
I was
opera.
lucky enough to be asked to do the Magic Flute for San
Exactly,
Diego
which was
Opera.
wonderful. And so it's a whole new world for you, I'm sure.
It's a totally new world, and I felt it should be there's no point if it doesn't look very Zandra Rhodes. It's got to look, and I felt because I trained as a textile designer, it should have a very patterned, surreal quality about it. We don't think we want reality on the stage.
No, well, and particularly with this opera, because it's a kind of a dream of an opera. It's kind of a fairy tale opera, rather like the Magic, but it's not terribly different from Flute. So I think that these ideas will probably support it very well.
It's just lovely working on Indian temples, and where the front curtain is going to be these fishermen on stilts. So it's really exciting.
That's terrific. Sandra, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
Pardonne ce transport d'un cœur irrité.
Bizet wrote The Pearl Fishers at a rather early age, and even though there were a couple of short comic operas that preceded this piece in his output, it was the first important opera that he wrote on commission from an actual opera company. It is, therefore, the work of a very talented but young composer with little experience actually writing opera. Let's put it this way. It's not Carmen, which is arguably one of the finest works ever written for the operatic stage. But while not quite at that level of genius, The Pearl Fishers has much to offer and is a delight to experience in performance. The music of The Pearl Fishers reflects the period in which it was written. Its beauties are to be found on the surface in well-written, memorable melodies that waft by us like the scent of a good French perfume. One of the most popular melodies in the work is found in the duet between Zurga and Nadir in the first act, au fond du temple saint. This is a melody that is instantly memorable because of its shape, and interestingly enough, because of its orchestral accompaniment, which features the ubiquitous French instrument, the harp. One of the other ways in which the work reflects its time is its use of typically French forms. Here, for instance, is Nadir's romance, or aria, Je crois entendre encore, written in the style of a barcarolle, a typical French form, with its gently rocking rhythm imitating a boat on placid water. But remember, what audiences demanded at the time were stories with exotic locales, and for 1863, Ceylon was about as exotic as you could get. Does Bizet use any Ceylonese tunes or authentic Indian raga techniques to get an exotic sound in the fabric of the music? Well, no, not really. But he does attempt a kind of imitation of what people would have imagined such music to sound like. It came in the use of what we call ornaments in the music, short lyrical embellishments to the vocal line that would remind the listener of a vaguely Eastern or Oriental atmosphere. These passages would be just different enough from surrounding melodic patterns to get the listener's attention. Here, for example, is Leila's prayer to Brahma in Act 1. Those little ornaments that are collected over a single syllable, usually an ah or an oo sound, and they should be considered as little decorations of the melodic line. Another good example from the Pearl Fishers that will be heard in the entrance of the hero, Nadir, in Act 2. So Bizet wasn't quite the researcher like Puccini trying to find authentic Japanese or Chinese music to include in Butterfly or Turandot. Much like other French opera composers of the mid-19th century, he satisfied his audiences with a few exotic compositional tricks of the trade that, well, work rather nicely, don't they? When you're out looking for resources to bone up on the Pearl Fishers, you may be a little disappointed. There haven't been any really terrific books on Bizet's work and life in the last 40 or 50 years. And many of the recordings, the classic recordings of the Pearl Fishers, haven't yet been re-released on CD. But there are two which are quite excellent, and I'm sure they'll suffice. The first one, a more modern recording, is with Barbara Hendricks as Leila, Jean Allaire as Nadir, and Gino Quilico as Zurga, all of these wonderful singers under the direction of Michel Plasson. This is a terrific recording with all the modern recording techniques. It's really quite stunning. The other recording is a re-release of one of the classic recordings of the Pearl Fishers, this with the Leila of Janine Michaud, the Nadir of the wonderful Nicolai Gueda, and the Zurga of Ernest Blanc, all under the direction of Pierre Dervaux. This is one of the great recordings of the Pearl Fishers, and both of these are readily available. Now, as I told you before, there aren't very many monographs or books written about the life and works of Bizet, but that gives me the opportunity to introduce you for the first time to one of the basic tools in operatic research. That is the New Grove Dictionary of Opera. This is a terrific resource. It's 4 volumes long, and it has articles on everything that you can imagine dealing with opera. The articles on Bizet, his life and works, the article on the Pearl Fishers, in fact, the article on Carmen, Bizet's other wonderful opera, are all stunning. This particular 4-volume work is also available in paperback so that you don't have to spend quite so much money on it as I did. I know you'll enjoy this resource. The Pearl Fishers is one of those works that has a surprising amount of truly gorgeous music that's entered the public's consciousness over the years. And because it's so rarely done in this country, it's always a refreshing addition to the repertory of any opera house. It's tuneful, colorful, has a touch of the exotic, and is substantial enough for a creative designer to dress it in a truly spectacular production. If you don't know this beautiful work, go get a recording, and definitely see it when you can. It's well worth the effort. I'm Nick Reveles, and I'll see you at the opera.